The moment the truth begins to surface is never as explosive as people imagine. It is quieter, more suffocating, as if reality itself is tightening around everyone involved, leaving less and less space for denial to exist. In the bold and the beautiful, the aftermath of a mistake is rarely contained to a single person, and what RJ had done did not just create a crisis. It set in motion a chain of emotional consequences that would force every character to confront parts of themselves they had long avoided. Because now, the question was no longer whether RJ had crossed a line. It was how far beyond it he had already gone. Inside the hidden space he had constructed, the illusion of control was beginning to fracture. At first, RJ clung tightly to the narrative he had built, the one where Electra would eventually understand, where time would soften her resistance, where isolation would clarify what he believed to be the truth. But the longer she remained there, the more that narrative began to erode. Electra did not adapt. She did not soften. Her fear did not transform into acceptance. Instead, it sharpened into something that challenged him in ways he had not anticipated. She refused to play the role he had written for her. That refusal forced RJ into a confrontation with something he had been avoiding: reality. The version of Electra he had imagined, the one who would eventually see his actions as proof of devotion, did not exist. And each time she pushed back, each time she asserted her autonomy in a space designed to strip it away, it created cracks in his belief system that he could not easily repair. Those cracks did not make him retreat. They made him unstable. And instability in a mind already operating under distorted logic does not lead to clarity. It leads to escalation. Outside, the search was no longer tentative. It had become focused, driven by a growing certainty that RJ was not just involved, but central to everything that had happened. Will moved through that realization with a mix of urgency and disbelief, struggling to reconcile the person he had known with the actions that now seemed undeniable. There was a part of him that still wanted to be wrong, that still searched for an alternative explanation that would allow him to avoid what this meant. But the evidence continued to align. Brooke, standing at the intersection of that truth, felt the full weight of her own internal collapse. The search for Electra was no longer just about rescue. It was about confrontation, about facing her son in a way she had never imagined she would have to. And the closer they came to finding him, the more she felt the fracture within herself deepen. Because she could not stop asking the question that had no answer. What had she gone wrong? It was not a question rooted in guilt alone, but in understanding. She replayed every moment, every conversation, every piece of advice she had given him, searching for the point where guidance had turned into permission. She knew, rationally, that RJ's actions were his own, but emotionally, she could not separate herself from the path that had led him here. And that realization made what she had to do next almost unbearable. When the location was finally uncovered, it did not feel like victory. It felt like inevitability. The space itself was hidden well enough to avoid casual discovery, but not beyond the reach of determined search. And as Will and Brooke stood outside it, the air between them carried a tension that neither of them could fully articulate. This was not just about opening a door. It was about crossing into a reality that would change everything once it was seen clearly. Inside, RJ sensed the shift before he understood it. The sound, subtle but distinct, the change in atmosphere that signaled something beyond his control was approaching. For a moment, everything inside him froze, caught between denial and recognition. He told himself it was nothing, that the world outside had not found him, that his control remained intact. But the illusion could not hold. When the confrontation came, it did not unfold with chaos. It was something quieter, more devastating. Brooke stepped forward first. She did not approach him as an authority, not as someone there to stop him, but as a mother facing the reality of what her son had become. And in that moment, everything else fell away: the search, the tension, the urgency. There was only the space between them, filled with a truth neither of them could escape. RJ looked at her, and for the first time, doubt fully surfaced. Not the small cracks that had begun to form earlier, but something deeper, something that threatened the entire structure he had built. Because Brooke was not reacting with anger, not immediately. She was looking at him with a kind of pain that he had not accounted for, a recognition that did not align with the narrative he had created. And that dissonance was enough to destabilize him. We'll move to Electra, his focus immediate, his urgency breaking through the tension that had held the moment still. But even as he reached her, even as the physical act of rescue began, the emotional confrontation between Brooke and RJ remained the center of everything. Because this was not just about what RJ had done. It was about who he had become in the process. Brooke's voice, when it came, was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried the weight of something far more powerful than anger, truth. She did not accuse him in a way that would push him further into defense. She spoke to him as someone who still believed he could see what he had done, who still believed that somewhere beneath the distortion, he could recognize the reality he had been avoiding. And that belief became the turning point. RJ's reaction was not immediate surrender. It was conflict. Everything inside him resisted the idea that he had been wrong, that his actions were not justified, that the love he believed he was protecting had been twisted into something harmful. But at the same time, the cracks that had been forming, the doubt that had been growing, now had a voice outside of his own mind. And he could not ignore it anymore. The collapse, when it came, was not dramatic. It was quiet, a shift in posture, a release of tension. The moment where resistance gave way to realization. Electra was no longer part of his world. She was someone he had taken from hers. That distinction, once fully understood, dismantled everything. Afterward, the silence was heavier than any confrontation could have been. The consequences did not need to be explained. They existed in the space between them, in a reality that could not be undone. RJ was no longer just someone who had made a mistake. He was someone who had crossed into something irreversible. And Brooke, standing there, felt the full weight of what it meant to love someone who had done that. Because love, in that moment, did not erase what had happened. It forced her to face it. Will, helping Electra out of the space that had held her, understood that the story did not end with her rescue. The emotional damage, the trust that had been broken, the relationships that had been altered, none of it would return to what it had been before. And RJ, left standing in the aftermath of his own actions, faced something he had not anticipated when he chose to follow his heart without restraint. Consequence, not as punishment alone, but as reality. Because the truth, once revealed, does not negotiate. It does not soften itself to make acceptance easier. It simply exists. And in that existence, it demands change. The question that remained, unspoken but unavoidable, was not whether RJ would face the consequences of what he had done. It was whether he would survive them as someone capable of becoming more than the worst moment of his life. And for Brooke, that question would define everything that came next. Because being a mother in that moment no longer meant protecting her son from a world. It meant helping him face it.